Hi, this is Mrs. Larson. We're going to talk about the two-party system evolution. We started it a little bit in class the other day, but we are going to continue with party eras in American history. What we went over previously is political parties, and I gave you that definition. We looked at one-party systems, two-party systems, multi-party systems. We talked about why the United States is a two-party system today. What I want to focus on most of all is the evolution of the two-party system. We are going to finish this portion of the PowerPoint. So if you would follow along, I'm going to hide myself. Don't be sad that I'm disappearing, okay? But there I go. Bye-bye. Have a good day. All right, so let's go through these. Let me make sure my little pen works here. All right, the main part that you need to understand, there are several key terms that I want to make sure that you know as we go through this. Let me pull him up a little bit. Before we even start, I want to make sure that you know what a party era is. And this is just a historical period in history dominated by one party. So when I talk about eras of party history or a party era, that means one political party is dominating for a certain number of years. Normally it's about 20 or 30 years. Another term that I want to make sure you understand is critical elections. And the next several slides are going to talk about critical elections. And mostly this is when a national crisis forces voters to confront divisive issues. For example, you will see slavery is going to tear the party apart, and different coalitions will form because of this, and it tends to lead to instability and new formations of party loyalty. So please make sure you understand a critical election is normally the dividing point in party eras. The last one that I want you to understand is called party realignment. And party realignment is triggered by a critical election that I just described. And the majority party becomes the minority party, and the minority party becomes the majority party, or the new dominating party in the party era. So keep those terms in mind as we go through this. It's really the purpose of seeing how the United States started as a two-party system and how it continues to persist. Remember, how we have our electoral system set up is really a large indicator why two parties normally dominate. So in the first elections right here, in the election of 1800s, we know that Adams was a Federalist and he defeated Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. In textbooks, he's also called a Jeffersonian Republican, and many times the first word is dropped there and they call them the Republicans. That does not mean that they are the modern day Republicans. Jefferson is often considered one of the founders of the Democratic Party. You will hear during elections, we are the party of Jefferson. So even though these have the word Republican in it, it is not the Republican Party that you know it today. It must be Democratic Republican, or if it's referring to Thomas Jefferson, the Jeffersonian Republican. So keep that in mind. One key thing that we will see during this era is in the election of 1800, Jefferson defeats Adams. We know that Alexander Hamilton is a key Federalist. He's a supporter of a strong federal government and a national bank. And the Federalists really dominated and had a coalition of financial, commercial, and manufacturing interests. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, and later with James Madison, supported a limited federal government and opposed the national bank. The Democratic-Republican coalition will eventually include farmers, laborers, planters, etc. A key thing about the election of 1800 is that this is the first time there is a peaceful transfer of power. I think you all noticed that in your notes when we were doing our terms, but it is a peaceful transfer of power. George Washington did it with Adams, but this is the first big election. So Adams quietly steps away and Jefferson assumes power. What we also note here is that this is the domination of the first era. And I want you to know that these dates are different depending on what source you're looking at. Sometimes people will say, let me go down and click my pen. Sometimes people will say that the founding era lasts from 1796 to 1824. But what basically is happening is that the Federalist Party will fade away, and we have a domination of one party being the Democratic Republican Party. They call this the era of good feeling between the 1800s and the early 1820s, which is really, we have one political party dominating the scene. Now, what happens after that is in the mid-1820s, and what I just said with the 1824 era, really the Democratic Republicans grow so large, they split into two factions. On the left, you'll see the Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson. This is where the era of mass political participation begins. Again, I said it's with the farmers and the common man. The Democratic Party supported voting rights for all white males. It opposed the National Bank, and it often used the spoil system to reward party loyalists. The opposite side, which is the National Republicans, and I'll turn my pen on again, the National Republicans are nicknamed the Whigs. Now, I know you've seen this in history before, but the Whigs are only around for a very short amount of time. So the National Republicans are often referred to as the Whigs. Now, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster supported high tariffs in the National Bank, and the Whig coalition was really made up of Eastern bankers, merchants, industrialists, owners of very large plantations, and the Whigs are known for electing two different presidents over time. This is sometimes known as the era of no real popular presidents, I should say, but William Henry Harrison is a Whig, and he was elected in 1840. We don't know a lot about William Henry Harrison as president because he died shortly after he was elected. The other Whig president, which you probably recall, is Zachary Taylor, and he was elected in 1848. So with this era, and we're still in the very first era of party development, what we will see is with this split to the Democrats and to the National Republicans, the Whigs and the Democrats will compete for quite a while. But we are going to have a critical election come up in 1860, and the critical election surrounds the issue of slavery. So in the 1850s, the parties, many, including the Whigs, did not want to take a firm stand on the issue of slavery, on abolishing it or continuing it. And one coalition, called the Republicans, took a stand against the extension of slavery into new territories that were being added to the United States. This Republican group eventually elects its first president, and the very first president on the Republican side is, I should use red, shouldn't I? Because red is the color for Republicans. So the Republicans dominate elections, and I can't say enough about this date. 1860 is a dividing era and starts the second big era of the two-party system. So the first is the development and the founding, and it goes through the different eras that I just talked about. The second one becomes Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and goes up until the date where FDR is elected. So the Republican Party emerges as the most dynamic party, really anti-slavery party in the critical election of 1860. So this is one of the first times that a minor party, and the Republicans started out as a minor party, that a minor party became a major party. Oftentimes, the GOP during their elections will refer to themselves as the party of Lincoln. Even in St. Joseph in February, the Republican Party has what are known as Lincoln Days, where they have a variety of speakers come in and talk to different groups about the Republican platform. So I just want you to know that the Democrats are the older party. Even though it went through changes, the Democratic Party can be traced back to Thomas Jefferson, and the Republicans can be traced back to Abraham Lincoln. So ever since 1860, this becomes the dominant party system. We have a two-party system, and it will be consistently the Democrats or the Republicans from this point on to present day. So I said already, Abe Lincoln wins office. During this era from 1860 to 1932, there were several Democrats who did achieve the presidency, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, but it still is dominated overall by the Republicans when you look at it in longer terms. Now the next one where we will see another critical election or a realigning election, remember I talked about that, the critical election, is the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932. Now we know in 1929 we had the stock market crash. It will lead to the Great Depression and eventually World War II. So during this time, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the president and really led us through the Depression era. So this era right now is dominated by the Democrats. Let me see what else I want to say on that. I think all of you know the New Deal program. Those were programs to aid the American public in terms of relief and recovery and reform. So that is what Franklin D. Roosevelt is associated with. Please know that New Deal politics are traced back to FDR. So FDR is very unique in the fact that he served 4 terms. No president has ever served 4 terms up from George Washington until this time. They went with precedent, which was 2 terms, and then you step down. But during this time, the Americans kept electing him. Shortly after the 4th term, where'd my little pin go, my colors? Shortly after this, I do want you to know that the 22nd Amendment was added after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and the 22nd Amendment said that a president can only serve 2 4-year terms. And so that is what the 22nd Amendment is as a direct result of FDR. So after FDR is elected to his 4th term, he dies shortly thereafter, and the great president from the great state of Missouri, Harry S. Truman, is elected, and he is reelected on his own in 1948. I think you might remember when I talked about polls saying and predicting incorrect things. This is a famous headline, Dewey defeats Truman. That wasn't correct, but Truman actually was. After 1948 and 1952, we have a popular general from World War II. He is actually from Kansas. Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected for 2 terms during a pretty peaceful time in the 1950s. They start the interstate system like I-80, I-29 that we know today. And then we come up to 1960. John F. Kennedy is elected and he defeats Richard Nixon. When he is assassinated in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson serves that last year and then is re-elected on his own. I will show you a video clip later when we come back from break where Lyndon B. Johnson states that he will not seek nor will he accept another term as President of the United States. So he decides very late in the game not to run for re-election in 1968. So from 1968 to the present, this is one of our last eras of divided government. And from 1968 to the present, you can see that it is going to be an era of divided. Remember when we talk about divided government, that it goes between Republicans and Democrats quite a bit. The pattern of divided government has really dominated our American politics since Nixon's election. Even from 1969 to 2010, the same party controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress for just 12 years. So that's a very short time in terms of party era. So we do have more heightened partisanship during this time. That means if there's more partisanship, there's more fighting between the political parties and less gets done. And when less gets done and nobody can agree to compromise, it is known as gridlock. No laws get passed. There's very little action in the executive and the legislative branches. So let me quickly run down through these last eras of the president. In 1968 and again in 1972, Richard Nixon is elected. He is a Republican, and he will serve until he resigns. Remember, Nixon is never impeached. The House was starting to draw up articles of impeachment, but they were never served. Instead, Nixon resigned. His vice president, Gerald Ford, took his place and assumed the presidency and later pardoned Nixon for any crimes. Many called that political suicide for Ford, but he said he had to do it to save the nation from any more turmoil that we had gone through. So very short term for Ford, although he does run against the next person, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter does win after the fiasco of the Watergate scandal. In 1976 to 1980, the peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter from Georgia, serves as our president. And then we have a two-term presidency of Ronald Reagan. And he led us through many initiatives strengthening our military during this time. The Cold War and his relationship with Gorbachev will help thaw those relations. And so we will talk more about all these presidents, but in particular, Reagan did have some big moments. His vice president runs in 1988, George H.W. Bush. He is a Republican, and he does win one term and is defeated when he ran for re-election in 1992 against Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, and so he was a governor that assumed the presidency once he beat George H.W. Bush. After that, I think most of you know Clinton was term limited. He could not run again after his two terms. So Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, was the Democratic nominee in 2000. Al Gore ran against George W. Bush, and George W. Bush, in one of the closest presidential elections that we have had, did win that election. In 2008, George W. Bush is term limited, and the election goes to Obama. And President Obama does win, and he has a two-term presidency, which will be up on January 20th, 2016, when the new president will be inaugurated. So those are the eras of the two-party system. I hope you understand that basic part. I do want you to know that political parties are on the decline. This question, why have political parties weakened in America? We have a decentralized political system. We have many areas where you can participate at the local and the state and the federal level. And sometimes we don't need that political party to fundraise for us or to provide press for us or to establish an agenda. We're doing that at local levels. If political parties and our governing system were more centralized, I think the political parties would have more of a dominant force. Our U.S. political culture, we have more independence. Americans overall consider themselves moderate, and they don't go to the extremes of the far right and the far left. So our U.S. political culture doesn't depend on parties as much. I've talked about the electoral system quite a bit in class, but I can't stress enough how our electoral system uh, really weakens political parties, especially our primary system. It really does a disservice to third parties as well. So I just wanted to mention that. Sometimes strict voter registration requirements hurt political parties because political parties need people to vote, and if they're not registered to vote, that creates a problem. Several other things, civil service reforms. These are just different changes that have taken place over time concerning politicians, and we will talk more about this topic in bureaucracy. There are more regulations of parties at the state level. Some people think that the president being chosen independently from Congress weakens political parties because you can't all go in at the same time on the same ticket, such as in parliamentary government. And to be nominated for president, candidates must cater to party activists in the primary, which hurts them later in the general campaign with different things that they say. Oops, let me go up here. So I think I'm to the end of this section. I might talk more about minor parties and post that as a review if you need more review on minor parties. But really the main point of this was to understand the two-party system, definitely looking at critical elections, definitely looking at realigning elections and party eras so that you understand why we have the two-party system in America. I hope you are having a great day and study, study, study. I will see you later for the test.